All right, well, let's get into it. And I want to start off today with just this simple statement. You know, it really does matter who you get your directions from. I appreciated what Patricia shared with us during her open time about how even one little word, right, letter even, can change the whole trajectory of where you're going. But the same can somewhat be true when it comes to where we are heading in life. And right here in the last 6 months, I have to admit, this is the third time that I've had to go through this, but my son Elijah is learning how to drive. We're kind of going through this driving process. And let me tell you, there are a few white-knuckle moments whenever I do driving with any of my kids, and it's been no different with Elijah. And I saw this funny little tweet this week that I thought was funny. It says, "Study shows teaching a teen to drive is the best way to improve your prayer life." I thought that was really funny. I will definitely say my prayer life definitely goes up maybe just a little bit more when I'm in the car with my kids. But, you know, all of us were in that place learning how to drive. But there was something that really jumped out at me a couple of weeks ago that really threw me for a loop. So I was driving with Elijah. We were going to Connorsville, and I asked Elijah, he jumps in the car, and I asked Elijah, "Okay, do you know how to get to Connorsville?" And he's like, "No, you're going to have to give me directions there." And I'm like, "You've lived in Western Wayne your whole life. How do you not know how to get to Connorsville?" And he's like, "Because I never really needed to know. You know, somebody was always driving me, so I never paid attention." And at first, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, "What in the world?" But then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, it makes sense. It makes sense. You know, he trusted the people that took him places. He knew that they would get him to Connorsville. So why did he need to pay attention on how to get to Connorsville? And that begs this question: what do you do, though, when maybe in life you have been given bad direction, or maybe you don't even know the direction? You know, me and most guys, I like what Patricia said, we don't like to admit it, but we don't like to admit when we're lost. And I think, you know, we like to make fun of guys for that. They get in the car, you know, because the way it works with me is I know that next turn is just the right one. I know that next one's the right one. That'll get us going in the right direction. We're going to go to the right place. And that is the way many of us treat life. Like, we go through life and we think, okay, I've got this whole thing figured out. I know where I'm going. And you know what? It might seem like I'm a little bit lost right now. It might seem like things are a little bit off right now. But you know what? I just know that right up ahead is just the right turn. I know that. I know that that's the right place. And then sometimes what happens is we get to that spot and we realize, wait a minute, this isn't the right place. Or we take the right turn anyway and it gets us even more lost. I think that's where so many of us are. And in life, so sometimes what we do is we ask other people for directions that are just as lost as we are. I mean, it can be a friend who maybe hasn't figured things out for themselves, or somebody at work. We often go to places and ask for directions from people that really aren't taking us to the right place. And so I'm asking you today, Will we ask someone to help us interpret the map called life, or will we turn to the one who drew the map? Because it really does matter. It really does matter. Now today, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 9. We're going to look through 18 verses today, verses 1 through 18 in Proverbs chapter 9. Now, when we started this series off, if you remember, we learn this verse. We've said it together every week. This verse is what is the very basis of this entire book. So I want us to read this again together. I want you to remember this verse. It says, "For the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Okay, so you have to start with the right person to be wise. If you're looking for the right direction, you have to find the right person. And unfortunately, we usually don't in this world. We have to look to the one who has created us, the one who has written out our life, the one who has given us purpose. And we've realized through this series, we've talked about influences and how influences can either be helpful or harmful to finding wisdom, and that we need to avoid the temptations that want to bring us down, and have a passion, like we talked about last week, that we need to have a passion for hating sin but loving people. Well, today, I will say this message today is kind of similar to the very first message of this series, because what we're going to see is that God is the source of wisdom. But this message is a little bit different in this way. Some of us maybe have gotten on what I'm going to call the wisdom wagon today, okay? We've gotten on the wisdom wagon. We want to learn more about who God is. We've sought after wisdom, but then what happens is we fall off. Something happens in life. We maybe give into an influence that's there or a temptation. And then what we do is we fall off the wisdom wagon. And so I want us today to kind of discover what it looks like when we fall off the wisdom wagon, and then how do we get back on it? Okay? And I think this passage really brings this out. So let's go ahead and let's just read this together. Okay? I want to ask you to read this with me. In verse 1, it says, that wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out its 7 pillars. Very interesting verse here to kind of start us off, because we see that this house that Solomon's writing about here and using as an example of wisdom is a mansion. It's a big house. It would have 7 pillars. Now, if you remember in the Bible, the numbers often mean something. So in this circumstance, we see the number 7. The number 7 means perfection. So he's saying wisdom has built her house, and wisdom is perfection. Well, there's only one who is perfect. And who is that? That's God himself. So this is this perfect mansion, this wisdom that we can learn from. And then it says there that she has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has also sent out her maids, and she calls from the highest point of the city. So here we see the host of this mansion, okay, offering people to come in, to take part. See, what I love about these two verses here is that it shows us that wisdom is not just for a select few. This invitation is open to anybody. And you know what that means for you and me? That means that we don't have any excuses not to seek wisdom. I know there's been times in my past where I'm like, well, I just don't know as much, or that's not an excuse. God is saying, wisdom is available to you. You may not always be the smartest person in the room, but if you seek after me and you look in my word and you connect with people who are of good influence in your life, you can be a wise person even if you aren't the most knowledgeable person. This invitation is for all of us. And so in verse 4 it says, let all who are simple come in here, she says to those who lack judgment. Come eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and you will live. Walk in the way of understanding. Again, wisdom's invitation is open to everyone. When I was looking at this week, there was something that really jumped out at me. I'm sitting here thinking in my head as I read this sounds very similar to a story I've read somewhere in the Bible. So I thought, and then I was looking through some notes and some places, and then it occurred to me, if you go into Luke chapter 14, there's a story that Jesus tells. It's a parable. He talks about a man who has created this great supper. He's made this great supper, and he gave out all these invitations to people, but nobody came. And so when we read in the story, it says that then he just invited everyone to come. He invited everyone to come in. And in both instances, in that story there in Luke chapter 14, but also there in Proverbs 9, as we read here of Solomon that we're looking at today, we realize that the invitation is offered, but yet so few take it up. So I'm hoping that that's not you. I'm hoping that the invitation that has been offered to you to grow in your faith, to grow in wisdom, is not one like we see there in Luke and here in Proverbs, one where you let come, the invitation comes, and you don't RSVP. I don't know that all of us are seeking out wisdom. We just kind of go through life day by day, and we don't really seek out what it is that God wants. Now let's keep reading here, because in verse 7 it says, whoever corrects a mocker invites insult. Whoever rebukes a wicked man incurs abuse. Do not rebuke a mocker, or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. Instruct a wise man, and he will be wiser still. Teach a righteous man, and he will add to his learning. So we see two different types of people here. There are those who welcome wisdom and those who don't. Those who, when they are corrected, welcome that correction, and those who don't. Which one are you? Which one are you? You know, really the idea here is that being teachable is essential in wisdom, in finding wisdom. You need to be a person that is willing to be taught. Teachability is so important. I mean, I know looking around here in the room, I'm sure some of you have either you own a business or you maybe supervise people or you're a teacher. You know how important this principle is. You have to be moldable. You have to be teachable. You have to be willing to allow God and even allow the good influencers in your life to be able to change the way that you look at things and the way that you think about things. This is so important. You know, this word here, though, there's two words that really are important. There's this word correct, and I want to bring this up here. This one right here is this word isar. It's in the Hebrew. It means to instruct, to chastise, and rebuke. And if you dig a little deeper, it's to train someone who doesn't, in this context, it's to train someone who doesn't want to be trained. You waste your time correcting someone who doesn't want it. Any of you know that this is true? If somebody comes into a role in your workplace or in your classroom or even maybe a child in your family and they don't want to be taught, you could say everything that you want to say. You could do everything that you try to do with them, but they won't be taught. So we see here this word correct, and then we see the word rebuke. How many of you like to be rebuked? Anybody in here love being rebuked? Don't see any hands on this one, okay? Nobody likes to be rebuked. But have you ever considered that sometimes you might need to be rebuked? And as we see in this passage, you should what? You should welcome being rebuked. But there's something more to this word that as well that I think is really important. We'll bring that up now. This word rebukes, okay? Do we have the language? Maybe I didn't put it in, okay? But in the original language, the word rebuke means to argue or be found right. So when you think of the word rebuke, we usually think of somebody like coming up to us and saying, "You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." But really what rebuking is talking it through. Trying to, again, the idea of being teachable. Talking through where someone has gone wrong and where they can go right. So it's not just jumping on someone's case. It's about actually having a conversation. Now, I'll tell you right now, this is an area that I've struggled with. Sometimes it's hard for me, you know, because I tend to be a very a black and white person. It's either right or it's wrong. And sometimes whenever I see someone with a different opinion, I struggle with that. Trying to help them understand what it is. Because I think, hey, this is simple. It's right or wrong. It's black or white. And I have to slow down a little bit. That's what this means. Rebuking means to actually sit down and try to understand and then try to guide them to the right place. Now, look at verse 10. And I think it's really interesting here because in verse 10, we kind of have a what would be like a parallel verse as we had all the way back in Proverbs 1:7. Look what it says here. It's just kind of a rephrasing of Proverbs 1:7 again. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of the wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So here it is, right in the middle of this passage, this chapter, where we see that, again, it's saying, okay, if you've fallen off the wisdom wagon, let me remind you again. And we see this in the book of Proverbs. There's a lot of repeating. I kind of think of this as kind of like talking to a child. Sometimes you got to repeat. Years ago, I shared in a sermon that repeaters are leaders. When you lead in your family, when you lead in your workplace, when you lead anywhere you're at, you have to repeat things over and over. And that's what Solomon's doing here. He's reminding his son, he's reminding us as the readers where it all begins. And then in verse 11, for through me your days will be many, and years will be added to your life. If you're wise, your wisdom will reward you. If you are a mocker, you alone will suffer. See, wisdom, or let's just say the lack thereof, the lack of wisdom can cost you days. Now what does that mean? What he's saying is that by your decisions and your lack of desire to be wise, If you go out and you make very unwise decisions, it can take away your days, and we know that. There are health things that can happen by making poor choices. There are consequences that come through it. There's added stress when you make unwise decisions. And what does that do? That takes away days. I like what James Smith, he was a professor that I had in Florida, that just a very wise man, but he said this in his commentary. He said, each individual has within him the power to choose wisdom and reap the reward, or to remain a scorner and pay the price. See, that is a decision that we have to make here. And so again, Solomon is saying, remember, God is the source of wisdom. And then look at verse 13. The woman folly is loud. See, God, we know in the scripture, he tends to whisper. But the woman folly, which is the opposite of wisdom. So you have wisdom and you have folly. Folly is loud, it's boisterous. She's undisciplined and without knowledge. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let me tell you, following after unwise people or giving into unwise ideas is a lot easier because it's very loud. And let me tell you, in our culture today, there's a lot of loud voices. A lot of loud voices. So are we going to listen to the one with the loudest voice, or the one whose voice is still and quiet but is eternal? You know, there's that old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? Sometimes what we do is we hear that squeakiness, that loudness, and we decide to focus on that. And I want us to think today about how we can get back to God's Word, get back to His truth, and get back to His wisdom. You know, in these three verses 13 through 15, there's some attributes of the opposite of wisdom here, this folly. Now, do you notice there that it's very turbulent? A person who is filled with folly lives a turbulent life. And it says there as well that it's a person that's without restraint, that doesn't hold back, that just jumps into things, that is willfully ignorant, that doesn't want to learn, isn't teachable, isn't willing to grow. I started off today by talking about the wisdom wagon, and how do we know if we have fallen off the wisdom wagon? Well, here's three of the reasons we can see that we can know that maybe we've fallen off, and that is that our lives are crazy and out of control, that there is no restraint in our lives, and that we don't want to learn, and that we don't want to grow. I want you to examine yourself right now, and I want you to think, are any of these attributes in my life? Because if so, maybe you've fallen off the wisdom wagon. And then look at verse 16. It says, let all who are simple come in here, she says to those who lack judgment. Stolen water is sweet, food eaten in secret is delicious. We've read verses similar to this already as we've gone through this series. And again, these things, being unwise, often comes with excitement even. It might even seem like it's something good in the short term. But look what it says in verse 18, what happens in the long term. But little do they know that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of the grave. See, if you enter the house, you are as good as dead. That is what the lack of wisdom can do in our lives. That's what the lack of wisdom can do. So again, I'm asking you this question after reading this. Are we off or are we on the wisdom wagon? We saw there that there was three things in the passage, but there's a couple other ones I want to point out as well. And one of them is that sometimes we can know that we're off the wisdom wagon when wisdom, and we'll put it up, it's up here, when wisdom comes easy. So often we think that we figure things out very quickly, especially when we're younger, and we think that we have it all figured out. If it's come easy for you to learn something, be very, very, very cautious about that. Because wisdom takes time in most cases. It takes work. It takes reflection. It takes a deepening relationship with God. So if you're figuring things out really, really quick, be very, very cautious. Because maybe it's not really all that wise. How about another one? And this kind of comes from this passage. When correction is insulting to you. When someone corrects you and it is insulting. This was something I think I've gotten better at. I think I still struggle with this to some degree. Sometimes nobody likes to be told when they're wrong. But I think in the past, whenever I would take it very personally. I would see it as negative. I think in the last few years, I've been trying to understand more and more that it's actually something that's positive, especially if it's coming from a person who cares about me, because they want the best for me. So consider that. When somebody corrects you, consider that maybe they're not doing it to get back at you or to hurt you, but because they love you and they want what's best for you. So think about that. If when you're corrected, you feel like you've been insulted, maybe you've fallen off the wisdom wagon. And another one that kind of fits in this as well is that when you think you've got it all figured out, at work, in your faith, life, when you think you've got it all figured out, let me tell you, if that's where you're at, I can guarantee you're not on the wisdom wagon. Because that means you're not in a place to be taught. You're not in a place to be, you're not teachable. God wants us all to be teachable. So the point today in all this is that standing corrected is the correct way to live. You know, we've all heard that phrase before, right? I stand corrected. That should be a lifestyle that we live in. As God confronts us with His truth, things in our life and the way we look at things are going to change. So we should always be willing to stand before God and say, God, I stand corrected. Because each and every one of us here today, we all are in need, in a place to stand corrected. You know, our lives are really, it's like a maze. And I want us to share a short video here to get us to think about life. And then let's talk a little bit more about what this looks like to stand corrected. So again, our lives, I mean, it is like a maze, but we have to get back to who is the writer of our map, like I shared earlier today. Who is it that writes out our life? We should be going to Him. And so my challenge for us this week is this. I want to invite you, I want to challenge you this week. Maybe it's today, maybe it's in the next few minutes, maybe it's throughout the week, to take 15 minutes to examine your life and determine, are you really seeking wisdom? Are you still on the wisdom wagon, or have you fallen off? And I want to give you just 3 really quick ways that you can get back on the wagon if you've fallen off. Okay, one of them is this one, is to look for people who have wisdom. Find people in your life who are wise, who love the Lord, who are further along in their walk with Jesus, that you can talk to and grow from. I can remember when I was younger, I think one of the things that benefited me the most was having people in my life. Now, let me tell you, when I've shared this some years ago. When I was young, my church that I was a part of split. There was a really bad split. There was some bad things that happened, and so I remember that we went to this building that was like a senior center for a while to have church services. And we would have Sunday school, and they didn't have like Sunday school classes. So what did we do? They had a kitchen in the back that they would make meals for there at the senior center, and that was our classroom. And oftentimes it was just me. Sometimes there was maybe one other high schooler, but it was just me and an elder of our church in that class. And I remember sitting there at times thinking, wow, you know, it's just me. What is this all about? But you know what? I look back now, and that was so transformative in my life. Because that man, he loved the Lord. He was very wise. And it was almost like I was getting this one-on-one instruction. I didn't realize it at the time. But it was such a huge blessing. And I want you to think of someone that's like that in your life. Hopefully you're thinking of them right now. Of that person that speaks into your life with wisdom and the truth of the knowledge of God. And if you can't think of somebody really quick, then you might not have that person in your life. And I want you to think of someone that you can reach out to. Let me tell you, if a person is wise, and you go up to them and you say, hey, I want you to help me to grow in my faith, they will be elated at that. They won't be like, because if that's a reaction, they're not wise. A wise person would love to invest in your life. So reach out to that person. Find that person. Take 15 minutes or more this week and think of that. Another one that I've already mentioned, but start accepting correction as a gift. There are a lot of people in our world that have never been given correction. Unfortunately, we see in our world today, we see a lot of broken families. And I think one of the things that a lot of kids are missing out on in a broken family is this idea of correction. And oftentimes when you don't have correction, when you don't have that person speaking into your life and correcting you, then you don't learn that there are the good things and the evil things in life, and you make poor choices. And unfortunately, we see our incarceration rates in our country as high as they've ever been. And a lot of it has to do with this, is that we're not accepting correction. If you want to be wise, it comes down to correction. Here's another one. Number 3, always look to learn something new. That comes back to being teachable. Are you willing to learn something new, or have you closed yourself off? You know, and I want us to think about that. If you're a student today, I want you to really think for a minute about who your friends are and what your friends are saying to you. What is the influence that they're putting in your life, and what are you listening to? And I'm not just talking about friends. It can be media. It can be music. It can be movies. What are you allowing to influence you? Who are you allowing to invest in you, allowing to pour into you? And should they be doing that? And if they shouldn't be, find those people in your life that you look up to, that follow the Lord, and let them invest in your life. You know what? A new word in your life might be the one that changes your life forever. Find that person in your life if you're a student or if you're not. You know, even as adults, you know, as we grow older, you know, we like to think that only students think that they know it all and that they figured it all out. We do the same thing. We might not be as overt about it, but sometimes we have this pride in our lives where we think we've got it all figured out. I want you to know today that you don't. You don't have it all figured out. You know, I learned this lesson here a while back. I was reminded of this a while back. My daughter Hannah, we like to talk about things. Hannah's a very deep thinker, and I really appreciate that about her. And one of the things that we've been talking about capital punishment, kind of how that works, you know. And she's brought up some points and ideas that have made me rethink the whole thing a little bit. I needed that. I needed to be teachable. And I needed to realize I don't know it all. And I've learned a lot from her, from what she shared with me. And I want to encourage you to think through it, through different things too. I'm not just talking about capital punishment, just anything. Allow God to teach you. Sometimes the ideas we think are biblical maybe aren't as much biblical as they are just something we've come up with ourselves. So again, examine your life and determine if you're really seeking wisdom. I want to close today with just some funny little things that I ran into this week. You know, we've all heard the term out of the mouth of babes, right? Sometimes some of the things we can learn from maybe the most unlikely of places. I want to share with you a few kids who have learned some wisdom and share it with you. But the whole point of this is that we might find wisdom from places we would have never expected, and always be ready to learn. So here's this one. One little boy named Patrick, who was 10 years old, said, "Never trust a dog to watch your food." That's some wisdom right there, and I'm sure, and he learned it from what? From experience, right? I'm sure he did that one time. Then you have Michael. When your dad is mad and asks you Do I look stupid? Don't answer him on that. Don't, that, okay? All right, there you go. How about this one? Never tell your mom, a wise man once told this little boy named Michael that never tell your mom that her diet's not working. You don't do that, all right? Another little boy named Randy said, stay away from prunes, all right? I'm not going to get into how he discovered that, all right? Another little girl said, never hold a dust buster, which was a thing you vacuum with, and a cat at the same time. Yes. Or how about Naomi? If you want a kitten, start out by by wanting a horse. You got to start high, and then you can come down, right, with mom and dad. How about Lauren? She said, felt markers are not good to use as lipstick. And then Joel said, don't pick on your sister when she's holding a baseball bat. That's all really good wisdom and really good advice. But again today, I'm asking you, who is speaking into your life? Get back on the wisdom wagon. Because, see, wisdom never comes easy, but when you seek it, life does.